October 15, 1944. The transport truck rattled along the dirt road leading to Camp Greenlawn, a small prisoner of war facility nestled in the farmlands of rural Pennsylvania. Inside, 23 German women sat in silence, their faces gaunt and hollow from months of dwindling rations. They had been captured in France as Allied forces pushed eastward, serving as communications specialists and administrative clerks for retreating Wehrmacht units. Now, they were prisoners in a country they had been taught to despise. Greta Hoffmann pressed her palm against her empty stomach, trying to quiet the gnawing ache that had become her constant companion. At 26 years old, she had once been robust and healthy, but 2 years of wartime rationing had carved away her strength. The other women shared her skeletal appearance, their auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had shrunk from hunger. They had subsisted on watery soup and stale bread for weeks during their journey across the Atlantic, each day bringing new depths of deprivation. As the truck came to a stop, Greta caught her first glimpse of the camp through the canvas opening. Unlike the bombed-out ruins of Europe she had left behind, this place looked almost pastoral. Neat wooden barracks surrounded by autumn fields, the smell of earth and hay carried on the afternoon breeze. But she steeled herself against any hope. Prisoners did not receive kindness. Prisoners received only what they deserved. Captain Elizabeth Morrison watched the German women step down from the transport. She had overseen male POW camps before, but this was different. These were not hardened soldiers but young women who looked more like refugees than enemies. Their eyes held the dull glaze of prolonged hunger, a look she recognized from reports coming out of liberated territories. The captain had served in North Africa and seen what war did to the innocent. These women had been complicit in their nation's crimes, yes, but they were also clearly suffering. Greta stood in formation with the others as an American officer addressed them in careful German. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, given proper quarters and medical care. The words meant nothing. She had heard promises before. What mattered was survival, and survival meant expecting nothing beyond bare subsistence. Her thoughts drifted to her mother and younger sister back in Hamburg, wondering if they had anything to eat tonight, wondering if they were even still alive beneath the Allied bombs that rained down on German cities with increasing frequency. The women were led toward their barracks, passing by what appeared to be a mess hall. Through the open windows, Greta caught a scent that made her stop mid-step. It was rich, savory, impossibly delicious. Something was cooking inside, something that smelled like meat and spices and abundance. Her stomach clenched painfully at the aroma. One of the guards noticed her reaction and smiled, but not cruelly. He said something in English she did not understand, gesturing toward the building. Whatever awaited them inside, it would change everything. The first night in Camp Greenlawn passed without sleep for most of the German women. They lay in their bunks, expecting harsh treatment that never came. The mattresses were thin but clean, the blankets rough but warm. Greta stared at the ceiling, her mind unable to reconcile what she had been told about American brutality with the reality of a heated barracks and intact windows. She had prepared herself for cold floors and starvation rations, not this strange civility. When dawn broke on October 16th, a bell rang outside, signaling morning assembly. The women dressed quickly in the plain gray prisoner uniforms they had been issued, replacing their tattered auxiliary corps attire. Greta noticed that even these simple garments were clean and properly sized, so different from the threadbare clothing she had worn for months. She pushed the observation aside, refusing to let her guard down. Kindness could be a weapon as devastating as any bullet. They were marched to the mess hall, that same building from which the incredible aroma had emanated the previous evening. Inside, long wooden tables were arranged in neat rows, and American soldiers were already eating breakfast. The smell hit Greta like a physical force: fresh bread, coffee, something sweet and something savory, combining in the warm air. Her knees weakened slightly, and she gripped the shoulder of the woman in front of her to steady herself. Sergeant William Hayes stood behind the serving counter, watching the German prisoners file in. He had fought in Italy and seen enough death to last a lifetime. These women looked terrified despite their attempts to maintain military bearing. The tallest one, dark-haired with sharp cheekbones, kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, as though expecting punishment. He had been briefed by Captain Morrison about treating them with dignity, but he wondered if they would accept it. The women were directed to form a line. Metal trays were placed in their hands, and then they were moving past the serving counter. Greta watched in disbelief as an American soldier spooned scrambled eggs onto her tray. Real eggs, not powdered. Then, a slice of bread with butter. Then something she had not seen in over 2 years. Strips of meat, glistening with fat, crispy on the edges. The smell of it made her dizzy. Sergeant Hayes pointed to the bacon and then to her tray, speaking slowly in English. "Try it. It's good." Greta did not understand the words, but his gesture was clear. He wanted her to take more. She shook her head slightly, certain this was some kind of test or trick. No prisoner received this much food. No German had eaten like this since before the war began. He smiled and added 2 more strips anyway, then pointed to a chair. "Sit, eat." Greta carried her tray to the nearest table and sat down with the other women. They all stared at their plates in stunned silence. This was more food than they had seen in a single meal for years, and that smell, that rich, smoky, impossibly delicious smell of the bacon, called to every starved cell in her body. For a long moment, none of the German women moved. They sat frozen before their trays, 23 prisoners who could not quite believe what lay before them. Greta's hands trembled as she gripped her fork. Around them, American soldiers ate their breakfast with casual efficiency, as though meals like this were ordinary. Perhaps for them, they were. But for women who had survived on cabbage soup and black bread, this was beyond comprehension. Anna Klein, a 22-year-old former radio operator from Munich, was the first to break. She picked up a strip of bacon with shaking fingers and brought it to her lips. The moment it touched her tongue, her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, and tears began streaming down her thin face. The other women watched her, and then, as though a dam had broken, they all began to eat. Greta lifted her own piece of bacon. The texture was unlike anything in her memory. Crispy yet tender, the fat rendering into pure flavor across her palate. Salt and smoke and richness exploded in her mouth. She had eaten bacon before the war, of course, but never like this. German bacon had been leaner, less indulgent. This American version was extravagant, almost sinful in its deliciousness. She closed her eyes and took another bite, feeling warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the food. Sergeant Hayes watched from his position at the counter. He had served breakfast to hundreds of prisoners over the past year, mostly German and Italian men who ate with the desperate efficiency of the perpetually hungry. But he had never seen this reaction. These women were not just eating. They were experiencing something profound, something that went beyond mere sustenance. One of them, a slight blonde girl who looked barely 20, was crying openly while she ate, tears falling into her scrambled eggs. Captain Morrison entered the mess hall and paused near the doorway, observing the scene. She had ordered full rations for the German women despite some protests from her superiors who believed prisoners should receive only minimum sustenance. But she had seen the condition they arrived in yesterday. These were not hardened enemy combatants. They were young women who had been slowly starving, caught in the machinery of a war they had not started. Feeding them properly was not just humane, it was strategic. A well-fed prisoner was more cooperative, more likely to provide useful information if needed. Greta finished her bacon and moved to the eggs. They were fluffy and seasoned with black pepper, accompanied by bread so soft and white it seemed like cake compared to the dense rye loaves of her homeland. With each bite, she felt her body responding, energy trickling back into limbs that had been merely surviving. But more than that, something else was shifting. A small crack appearing in the armor of hatred and propaganda she had worn for years. How could a country that fed its prisoners like this be the monsters she had been told about? How could people who showed such abundance to their enemies be anything but incomprehensibly different from what she had believed? The second day of proper meals brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of Camp Greenlawn. The German women still maintained their wary distance, speaking only in hushed German among themselves, but the desperation that had marked their arrival had begun to soften. Greta noticed it in the way Anna no longer clutched her fork like a weapon, in the way their footsteps toward the mess hall had quickened with something that resembled anticipation rather than dread. Breakfast on October 17th brought new surprises. Alongside the now familiar bacon and eggs appeared Small dishes of strawberry jam, pancakes drizzled with maple syrup, and fresh milk in glass bottles. Greta spread the jam on her bread with careful precision, making each precious bite last. The sweetness was startling, almost painful in its intensity. Sugar had been rationed in Germany for so long that she had forgotten what real fruit preserves tasted like. Sergeant Hayes had begun learning a few German phrases from a small handbook. As he served the women that morning, he pointed to the pancakes and said in carefully practiced German, "Pannkuchen, gut." His pronunciation was terrible, but several of the women smiled despite themselves. Greta found herself nodding at him, a gesture that felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught. You did not smile at the enemy. You did not accept their kindness as genuine. But the food made liars of all her training. Each meal chipped away at the certainty she had carried across the ocean. Private Thomas Chen, whose family ran a restaurant in San Francisco, had taken particular interest in the German prisoners' reactions to American cuisine. He began experimenting with the menu, adding small touches that he thought might appeal to European palates. A sprinkle of cinnamon on the morning oatmeal, fresh herbs in the evening stew. He watched their faces as they discovered each new flavor, cataloging their responses with the attention of an artist. By the end of the first week, something unprecedented began to happen. During lunch on October 22nd, one of the American guards sat down at the end of the table where several German women were eating. He did not speak, simply ate his own meal quietly. The women tensed at first, but when he made no move to intimidate or harass them, they gradually relaxed. The next day, 2 more guards joined different tables. Within days, the mess hall had transformed from a place of strict separation into something that resembled, however awkwardly, a shared space. Greta found herself seated across from a young soldier named Private James Mitchell, a farm boy from Iowa with freckles and red hair. He pointed to his bacon and then to hers, saying something in English she could not understand. But his gestures were clear. He was asking if she liked it. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. He grinned broadly and gave her a thumbs up, a gesture that transcended language. In that moment, looking at his open, friendly face, Greta felt the first real stirring of doubt about everything she had believed about Americans. They were supposed to be cold, calculating enemies. This boy looked like he could have been her younger brother. November 3, 1944. The first letters from Germany arrived at Camp Greenlawn, delivered through the International Red Cross. Captain Morrison distributed them during evening assembly, calling out names in careful German pronunciation. Greta's hands shook as she received the thin envelope bearing her mother's handwriting. She had not heard from home in nearly 4 months, and the weight of that silence had been crushing. That night, the barracks fell silent as the women read their letters by lamplight. Greta unfolded the single page, noting how thin the paper was, how her mother's normally steady script had become spidery and weak. The words were carefully chosen to pass censorship, but their meaning was unmistakable. Hamburg was starving. Her mother and sister survived on rations that grew smaller each week, 200 grams of bread per day. Watery soup made from turnips and potato peels. The coal for heating had run out, and winter was coming. Her mother wrote of neighbors who had simply stopped waking up, their bodies too depleted to continue. Anna sat on the bunk beside Greta, her own letter clutched in trembling hands. Her family in Munich reported similar conditions. Her younger brother, only 14 years old, had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last defense force of old men and children. Her father had died in the bombing of their apartment building in September. Her mother was living in a cellar with 12 other families, sharing 1 loaf of bread among them daily. The letter ended with a plea, "If you have any food to spare, send it. We are so hungry." The contrast was devastating. That very evening, the German women had eaten beef stew with carrots and potatoes, followed by apple pie with cream. Greta had consumed more calories in a single day at Camp Greenlawn than her family received in a week. The guilt twisted in her stomach like a knife. She looked down at her own body, already beginning to regain some of the weight she had lost. Her face was less hollow, her strength returning. Meanwhile, her mother and sister were slowly dying of hunger in the ruins of their city. Across the barracks, quiet weeping filled the darkness. These were not tears of self-pity but of survivors' guilt and helpless rage. They were prisoners being fed like guests while their families starved like animals. Sergeant Hayes, making his evening rounds, heard the crying and paused outside the barracks door. He had been briefed about the letters, knew they would bring difficult news. He thought about his own mother back in Chicago, how she always made sure he took extra helpings at Sunday dinner, how she worried he was not eating enough even when he clearly was. The next morning, the German women entered the mess hall with changed faces. They ate mechanically, without the wonder that had marked previous meals. Greta looked at her bacon and thought of her sister's empty plate. She forced herself to eat anyway, knowing that refusing food would not fill her family's stomachs. But the taste had changed. What had seemed like kindness now felt like cruelty of a different sort. Abundance in captivity, while loved ones perished in freedom. Captain Morrison noticed the change immediately. The German women who had begun to show signs of recovery now moved through the camp, like ghosts again, their eyes distant and haunted. She understood why. The letters from home had reminded them of the impossible position they occupied, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. That evening, she called Sergeant Hayes and Private Chen to her office with an unusual proposal. On November 7th, the German women received a surprising announcement. They were being given the opportunity to work in the camp kitchen under supervision. It was voluntary, and they would receive no additional privileges beyond the chance to stay busy. Captain Morrison watched their faces carefully as the translator conveyed the message. She was gambling that purposeful activity might ease their guilt, that contributing something might restore a sense of dignity that charity alone could not provide. Greta was among the first to volunteer. The idleness of captivity had become unbearable, each empty hour a reminder of her helplessness to aid her family. At least in the kitchen, her hands could be useful. Anna joined her, along with 6 other women who seemed desperate for any distraction from their thoughts. Private Chen greeted them the next morning with cautious optimism, gesturing to the stations where they would work, peeling potatoes, washing vegetables, measuring ingredients under watchful eyes. The kitchen was warm and bright, steam rising from massive pots on the industrial stoves. The abundance of ingredients was staggering. Sacks of flour and sugar stood stacked against the walls. Crates of fresh vegetables arrived daily from local farms. The meat locker held more beef and pork than Greta had seen in years. Private Chen showed them how to prepare American dishes, demonstrating the proper way to season a pot roast, how to make biscuits from scratch, the precise moment when scrambled eggs achieved perfect fluffiness. Greta found herself absorbed in the work. Her hands remembered the motions of cooking from before the war, when her mother's kitchen in Sturmsee, Hamburg had been a place of warmth and plenty. There was something meditative about peeling potatoes, about chopping onions until tears came for reasons that had nothing to do with grief. Anna proved surprisingly skilled with pastry, her careful hands creating lattice work for apple pies that earned genuine praise from Private Chen. As the days passed, the kitchen became a neutral territory where language barriers mattered less than shared purpose. Private Chen taught them English words for ingredients and cooking techniques: flour, butter, stir, bake. The women taught him German words in return, laughing at his pronunciation of Kartoffel and Zwiebel. Sergeant Hayes often stopped by to sample their work, offering exaggerated gestures of approval that needed no translation. But the real transformation came when Captain Morrison approved a new request. The German women asked if they could prepare a traditional German dish for the camp. They wanted to make Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes, using the abundant ingredients available. It was a taste of home made possible by their captors' generosity. Private Chen agreed immediately, curious to learn new techniques. As Greta grated potatoes beside Anna, mixing in eggs and flour and onions, she felt something shift inside her chest. Perhaps there was a way to honor both worlds. Perhaps surviving well while others suffered was not betrayal but responsibility. November 20th brought the first snow to Camp Greenlawn, blanketing the Pennsylvania countryside in white silence. Inside the warm kitchen, a quiet revolution was taking place. What had begun as supervised work duty had evolved into something more complex. Private Chen found himself not just instructing the German women but learning from them, discovering techniques and recipes that stretched back generations in their families. Greta showed him how her grandmother had made sauerbraten, the traditional pot roast marinated in vinegar and spices for days until the meat became fork tender. Even with limited ingredients, she could recreate the essence of the dish. Private Chen watched her work with growing respect, noting how she adjusted measurements by instinct rather than following rigid recipes. Anna taught him about proper bread making, the patience required to let dough rise twice, the exact moment when crust achieved the perfect golden brown. The exchange went both ways. Private Chen introduced them to stir-frying techniques from his family's restaurant, the importance of high heat and constant motion. He showed them how to make cornbread, a thoroughly American staple that fascinated the German women with its sweet, crumbly texture. Sergeant Hayes brought in his mother's recipe for fried chicken, and together they worked through the steps of buttermilk soaking and seasoned flour coating. But Private Chen was teaching more than cooking. As they worked side by side, he spoke about his family's journey from China to San Francisco, about being seen as foreign in the country of his birth. He talked about the Japanese internment camps where his friend's family had been imprisoned, how fear could make people forget their own values. His English was simple enough that Greta, whose language skills were improving daily, could understand most of what he said. She began to see parallels she had never considered before. Her nation had built camps too, but for far darker purposes. One afternoon, while teaching the women to make apple butter, Private Chen asked Greta about her life before the war. She found herself describing her childhood in Hamburg, the bookshop her father had owned. The Sunday afternoons spent reading in their small apartment overlooking the Elbe River. She spoke of her university studies in languages, cut short when the war demanded all young people serve the Reich. Anna added her own stories of music lessons and dreams of becoming a concert pianist, interrupted by mandatory auxiliary corps service. Sergeant Hayes, overhearing their conversation, realized something profound. These women had not been ideological zealots. They had been ordinary young people whose lives were hijacked by forces beyond their control. He thought of his own sister back home, how easily she could have been shaped by different circumstances, different propaganda. The line between victim and perpetrator was perhaps thinner than he had believed. By the end of November, the kitchen had become the heart of an unexpected community. Guards and prisoners worked together, united by the universal language of food preparation. They laughed at mistakes, celebrated successes, and shared stories that gradually dissolved the categories of enemy and ally. Greta began to understand that freedom was not just the absence of captivity. It was the ability to choose who you wanted to become, regardless of where you started. December 1st, 1944. The kitchen preparations took on new urgency as Christmas approached. Captain Morrison had approved a special holiday meal, and Private Chen worked with the German women to plan a menu that would honor both American and German traditions. Greta suggested Stalin, the traditional Christmas bread filled with dried fruits and dusted with powdered sugar. Anna proposed Lebkuchen, spiced cookies that her grandmother had made every December since she could remember. But it was during the planning of this meal that the most difficult conversation occurred. Private Chen asked the German women if they understood what their country had done. Not the military campaigns or strategic decisions, but the camps, the systematic murder of millions. The reports had been filtering back for months, growing more detailed and more horrifying. At first, the German women had dismissed them as propaganda, unable to believe their nation capable of such atrocities. Greta stood at the kitchen counter, her hands still covered in flour from kneading bread dough. Private Chen had shown her photographs that morning, images taken by Allied soldiers liberating camps in Poland and Germany, the skeletal figures behind barbed wire, the piles of bodies, the evidence of industrialized death. She had vomited in the corner of the kitchen, her body rejecting not just the images, but everything they meant about the world she had believed in. Anna sat on a stool, her face pale and tear-streaked. She kept repeating the same phrase in German. Wir wussten es nicht. We did not know. But Private Chen gently challenged that assertion. Did you not wonder where your Jewish neighbors went? Did you not see the laws restricting their movements, their businesses, their lives? The women had no answers that satisfied even themselves. They had chosen not to see, not to ask questions, not to consider what their silence permitted. The kitchen fell silent except for the bubbling of pots on the stove. Sergeant Hayes, present for the conversation, spoke quietly. My grandmother always said you cannot unbreak an egg. You can only decide what to do with the pieces. He looked at the German women with an expression that was neither accusation nor absolution. The question is not whether you knew or should have known. The question is what you choose to do now that you cannot pretend ignorance anymore. Greta wiped her hands on her apron and returned to her bread dough. She kneaded it with fierce concentration, feeling the resistance of the dough against her palms. Each push and fold was a kind of penance, inadequate but necessary. She thought of her mother's letters describing starvation in Hamburg, and for the first time allowed herself to wonder about other mothers who had starved in camps her nation built, who had died not from war but from deliberate cruelty. That evening, the German women worked in subdued silence, preparing the next day's meals with mechanical precision. But something fundamental had shifted. They could no longer hide behind the excuse of following orders or serving their country. They had been part of a machine that devoured innocence, and no amount of American kindness could erase that stain. The food they prepared now tasted different in their mouths. It was not celebration but communion, an acknowledgement of debt that could never be fully repaid. December 10th arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow that isolated Camp Greenlawn from the surrounding countryside. The holiday meal planned with such care took on new meaning in the wake of recent revelations. Greta and the other German women worked alongside Private Chen and the American kitchen staff, preparing dishes that bridged two cultures neither side fully understood anymore. The Stollen rose in the ovens beside cornbread stuffing. Lebkuchen cooled on racks next to pecan pies. Captain Morrison had made an unprecedented decision. The holiday meal would be served family-style, with guards and prisoners eating together at shared tables. Some of her superiors had questioned the wisdom of such fraternization, but she held firm. These women were grappling with truths that shattered their entire understanding of themselves and their nation. Isolation would only drive them deeper into despair or denial. Community, however uncomfortable, offered a path toward something resembling redemption. The mess hall had been decorated with modest care. Paper snowflakes cut by both American soldiers and German prisoners hung from the ceiling. Pine branches brought in from the surrounding forest filled the space with fresh evergreen scent. As the women carried platters of food to the tables, Greta noticed how the boundaries between server and served had blurred. Private Mitchell helped carry her heavy roasting pan. Sergeant Hayes held the door open for Anna as she brought out warm rolls. When everyone was seated, Captain Morrison stood to address the gathering. She spoke in English first, then waited as one of the German women who had become proficient in the language translated. We gather here not as victors and vanquished, but as human beings trying to find our way through darkness. What we share tonight is not forgiveness, which none of us can grant for crimes committed against others. It is simply the recognition that we are all capable of both terrible wrong and unexpected grace. The meal began in awkward silence, forks clinking against plates, the sound of chewing amplified by tension. But gradually, conversation emerged. Private Chen asked Anna about her Lebkuchen recipe, and she explained the importance of letting the spices meld for weeks before baking. Sergeant Hayes told Greta about his family's Christmas traditions in Chicago, how his Polish grandmother made pierogi every Christmas Eve. The food became a bridge across which tentative connections could form. Greta tasted the stollen she had helped bake and was transported momentarily to her childhood, to Christmas mornings when the world seemed safe and knowable. But she could not escape back to that innocence. She thought of families who would never gather for holiday meals again because her nation had murdered them. The sweetness of the bread turned bitter in her mouth. Yet, she kept eating, kept sitting at this table with these people who had every reason to hate her but chose something more complicated instead. As the evening progressed, someone began singing Silent Night in German. American voices joined in with English words, the two languages weaving together in imperfect harmony. Greta sang and wept simultaneously, mourning what her country had been and what it had become, while also experiencing the strange mercy of being seen as human despite everything. January 8, 1945. The new year arrived with brutal cold and news of Germany's desperate winter offensive in the Ardennes. The German women listened to radio reports with complicated emotions, hearing of their countrymen's suffering while living in relative comfort. In the kitchen, work continued as a form of therapy, a way to channel guilt and confusion into something tangible and useful. Private Chen had begun a project that would define the winter months. He proposed creating a cookbook that documented both American and German recipes, written in both languages. It would serve as a training manual for future camp kitchen workers, but more importantly, it would be a record of what had happened in this unlikely space, a testament to the possibility of connection even between enemies. Greta took to the project with intense focus. Each evening after kitchen duties, she sat at a small desk in the barracks, carefully transcribing recipes in her neat German script while Anna translated them into English on facing pages. They wrote down Private Chen's technique for perfect fried chicken alongside instructions for Rindsrouladen, beef rolls stuffed with bacon and pickles. Cornbread recipes appeared next to formulas for pumpernickel bread. But the recipes became more than simple instructions. In the margins, the women added notes about context and memory. Greta wrote beside her Kartoffelpuffer recipe, "My grandmother made these every Sunday. She believed that potatoes fried in butter could solve any problem." She died in the bombing of Hamburg in 1943. Anna's Apfelstrudel recipe included the notation, "My mother taught me to stretch the dough until you could read newspaper through it. I do not know if she is still alive to make this anymore." The American soldiers contributed their own stories. Private Mitchell wrote beside his mother's meatloaf recipe, "This is what home tastes like. My mom says the secret is equal parts beef and pork, and cooking it low and slow. She makes it every Sunday, and I dream about it over here." Sergeant Hayes added to his fried chicken instructions, "My grandmother brought this recipe from Poland. She said that good food is how you tell people you love them when words are not enough." The cookbook became a collaborative act of preservation and mourning. Each recipe was a small defiance against the erasure of war, an insistence that individual lives and family traditions mattered even as the world tore itself apart. Private Chen carefully illustrated the pages with simple drawings of ingredients and cooking techniques, adding beauty to the practical instructions. By the end of January, the cookbook had grown to over 100 pages. Captain Morrison examined it one evening, reading through the recipes and their accompanying stories. She recognized it for what it truly was, not just a collection of cooking instructions but a document of transformation. These pages recorded the gradual breakdown of propaganda's hold, the slow recognition of shared humanity, the beginning of something that might eventually become reconciliation. Greta held the finished cookbook in her hands and realized that she had created something that would outlast the war. Long after Camp Greenlawn closed, long after the prisoners returned to whatever remained of their homes, these recipes would exist as proof that even in captivity, even in guilt, people could still choose to build rather than destroy. February 14, 1945. Valentine's Day brought an unexpected gift to Camp Greenlawn. A shipment of fresh oranges arrived from Florida, bright bursts of color against the gray winter landscape. Most of the German women had never tasted an orange before. Citrus fruits had been impossibly expensive luxuries in pre-war Germany and completely unavailable once rationing began. Private Chen watched their faces as he distributed the fruit, amused by their confusion about how to eat something so foreign. Greta held the orange in her palm, marveling at its weight and texture. The dimpled skin released a sharp, clean fragrance when she pressed her thumb against it. Private Mitchell demonstrated how to peel it, and she followed his example, pulling away the thick rind to reveal the jeweled segments beneath. The first bite was a revelation. Sweetness and acid balanced perfectly, juice flooding her mouth with flavors that seemed impossibly bright after months of winter meals. Anna closed her eyes as she ate her orange, making small sounds of pleasure that made the American soldiers laugh with genuine delight. But it was the realization that followed which struck Greta most profoundly. This taste, this experience of simple abundance, was normal for Americans. They had grown up with fresh fruit, with choices, with the expectation that such things would be available. She thought of her childhood in Hamburg, where an apple was a special treat and bananas were something seen only in picture books. The material gap between the two nations was staggering, and it explained so much about why the war had turned as it did. That evening, inspired by the oranges, Private Chen taught the women to make an American dessert he called orange chiffon cake. They whipped egg whites to stiff peaks, folded in orange zest and juice, created something impossibly light and fragrant. As the cake baked, filling the kitchen with citrus perfume, Greta found herself imagining a different life. What if she had been born here, in this land of plenty? Would she have become a different person? Would she have made different choices? The question haunted her because she knew the answer was yes. Circumstances shaped people as surely as heat transformed raw ingredients into finished dishes. She had been molded by scarcity, by propaganda, by a culture that valued obedience over questioning. These American soldiers had been shaped by abundance, by relative freedom, by a system that, however imperfect, allowed for dissent and individual choice. Neither was entirely good or entirely evil, but the outcomes were devastatingly different. Anna sat beside her as they waited for the cake to finish baking. "I keep thinking about what home means," she said quietly in German. "I thought it was Hamburg. I thought it was my family and the streets I grew up on. But maybe home is not a place you come from. Maybe it is the place where you discover who you actually are, without all the lies." Greta nodded slowly, understanding that her friend had articulated something they were all beginning to feel. They were homesick not for Germany, but for a version of themselves they had never been allowed to become. March 23, 1945. The radio in Captain Morrison's office crackled with reports of Allied forces crossing the Rhine River, pushing deep into German territory. The war's end was no longer a question of if, but when. In the barracks, the German women gathered around their own small radio, listening to descriptions of their homeland's collapse, with expressions that mixed relief and dread. Cities reduced to rubble, refugees streaming westward, the systematic dismantling of everything they had once known. New letters arrived from the Red Cross, but many of the German women received nothing. The postal system in Germany had effectively ceased to function in many regions. Greta had not heard from her mother or sister since January, and the silence terrified her more than any bad news could. Anna received a letter from a distant cousin in Switzerland, who reported that Munich had been bombed so heavily that entire neighborhoods no longer existed. Her family's address was in one of those destroyed zones. She might be an orphan now, with no way to confirm it. In the kitchen that afternoon, the work continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The German women moved through their tasks mechanically, their thoughts clearly elsewhere. Private Chen tried to maintain normalcy, demonstrating a new technique for making hollandaise sauce, but even he seemed distracted. The news from Europe was overwhelming in its finality. Everything was ending, and none of them knew what would emerge from the rubble. Sergeant Hayes found Greta standing alone in the cold storage room, staring at the shelves lined with food. "Thinking about your family?" he asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "I know it does not help," he continued, "but they would want you to survive. They would want you to eat, to stay strong, to live whatever life becomes possible after all this ends." Greta turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "How do I live knowing they might be dead while I am safe? How do I deserve this warmth, this food, this kindness?" He had no answer that could satisfy such questions. Instead, he simply stood with her in the cold room, bearing witness to her grief. After several minutes, he spoke again. "My rabbi used to say that surviving is not the same as deserving. Life does not operate on fairness. All you can do is honor those you love by becoming someone they would be proud of, by choosing to be better than your circumstances required you to be." That evening, Captain Morrison called an assembly. She announced that as the war entered its final phase, plans were being made for the prisoners' eventual repatriation. They would be sent back to Germany once hostilities ceased and conditions allowed. The words hit the German women like physical blows. Return to what? To ruined cities and dead families? To a country that would be occupied by foreign armies, stripped of sovereignty, forced to confront the full horror of what had been done in its name? Greta lay in her bunk that night, unable to sleep. For the first time, she allowed herself to think the unthinkable. What if she did not want to go back? What if the life she had built here, however strange and painful, was more real than anything waiting for her in the ashes of Germany? May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came through the radio in the early morning hours, and by breakfast time, the entire camp knew that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. In the mess hall, American soldiers celebrated with cheers and embraces, their relief palpable after years of conflict. The German women sat silently at their tables, picking at their food, caught between shame and an exhausted sense of relief that the killing had finally stopped. Captain Morrison gave the soldiers the day off from regular duties, but asked the German women to gather in the main hall that afternoon. When they assembled, she stood before them with an expression that was both official and deeply human. Through a translator, she explained that arrangements were being made for their repatriation. Ships would begin carrying prisoners back to Germany within months. They would be processed through displaced persons camps and eventually released to find whatever remained of their former lives. Then she said something unexpected. However, given the exceptional circumstances of this camp and the relationships that have been built here, the United States government is prepared to consider asylum applications for any prisoner who wishes to remain in America. This is not a guarantee of approval, but it is an opportunity that would not normally be available to former enemy combatants. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Stay in America? Was such a thing even possible? Greta felt her heart racing. The possibility had been forming in her mind for weeks, but she had not dared to speak it aloud. Now it was real, tangible, a choice she could actually make. She looked around at the other women, seeing the same conflict written on every face. To stay would mean abandoning their homeland, possibly never seeing their families again. But to return meant facing a destroyed country, probable starvation, and the collective guilt of a nation that had committed unspeakable crimes. That night, the barracks buzzed with frantic conversation. Anna was adamant that she would stay. I have no family left to return to. Munich is rubble. What am I going back for? To starve in the ruins of a country that murdered millions? Others argued the opposite. Despite everything, Germany was still their home. Their families needed them. Running away to America would be cowardice, an abandonment of responsibility to help rebuild. Greta sat on her bunk, weighing impossible choices. If her mother and sister were alive, they would need her. But if they were dead, returning would mean only suffering for the sake of suffering. Here in America, she had discovered capacities in herself she never knew existed. She had learned English, developed real skills in the kitchen, formed genuine friendships across enemy lines. She had begun to understand what it might mean to live in a society that valued individual choice over collective obedience. Private Chen found her the next morning in the kitchen, staring at the cookbook they had created together. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "you have already shown more courage than most people ever have to summon. There is no wrong answer here. There is only what you can live with." Greta nodded, her decision crystallizing in that moment. She could not live with returning to a past that had been built on lies. She would stay and try to build something true. June 20th, 1945. Of the 23 German women who had arrived at Camp Greenlawn 8 months earlier, 11 chose to apply for asylum in America. Greta and Anna were among them, along with 9 others who had concluded that their futures lay in building something new rather than returning to salvage something destroyed. The remaining 12 prepared for repatriation, gathering their few belongings and writing farewell letters to the friends they had made. The asylum applications required extensive interviews and background checks. Captain Morrison spent hours with each woman, documenting their stories and assessing their sincerity. She wrote in her official reports that these prisoners had demonstrated genuine transformation, that they had confronted the truth about their nation's crimes with appropriate horror, and that they had shown consistent dedication to becoming contributing members of a free society. Her recommendation carried significant weight with the immigration authorities. While they waited for decisions on their applications, the women who were staying continued working in the kitchen. Private Chen had secured permission for them to train for positions in civilian food service after their release. They learned American health and safety regulations, proper restaurant procedures, and advanced cooking techniques. Greta discovered she had a particular talent for baking, creating pastries that impressed even the most critical evaluators. Anna excelled at menu planning and inventory management, her mathematical mind finding satisfaction in the logistics of feeding large groups efficiently. The women who were leaving departed in small groups throughout July. Each goodbye was wrenching, a severing of bonds forged in the strangest circumstances. They had been prisoners together, students together, survivors together. Now they were choosing different paths toward uncertain futures. Greta embraced each departing friend, pressing small packages of food into their hands for the journey. Cookies wrapped in cloth, dried fruit saved from kitchen work. Small acts of care that felt inadequate but necessary. By August 1st, only the 11 asylum seekers remained at Camp Greenlawn. The camp itself was being decommissioned, soon to be converted back to its original purpose as a storage facility. The women were transferred to a transitional housing program in nearby Harrisburg, where they would live while their applications were processed and they sought employment. Private Chen helped them move, driving the truck that carried their few possessions to their new temporary home. The transitional house was run by a Quaker organization dedicated to helping refugees. It was clean and simple, with shared bedrooms and a communal kitchen. The director, a fast, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, greeted them with practical warmth. "You will work for your keep," she explained in careful German, "cooking, cleaning, helping with the younger refugees. But you will also have time to look for permanent employment and continue learning English. This is not charity. This is partnership." Greta stood in the house's kitchen that first evening, helping prepare dinner for the 24 residents. It was smaller than the camp kitchen, more intimate, but the work was familiar and comforting. As she chopped vegetables alongside Anna, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was building something of her own choosing. Not following orders, not serving a cause, but simply living and working and trying to become someone she could respect. October 15, 1950. 5 years to the day after Greta Hoffmann first arrived at Camp Greenlawn as a prisoner of war, she stood in the kitchen of her own small restaurant in Harrisburg. The establishment was modest, occupying a corner storefront on 2nd Street, but it was hers. Well, hers and Anna's. They had pooled their savings from years of kitchen work and opened Harmony Table 6 months earlier, specializing in what they called bridge cuisine, German recipes adapted with American ingredients and techniques. Tonight was special. Captain Morrison, now retired from military service, had arranged a reunion dinner. Private Chen was coming from San Francisco, where he had taken over his family's restaurant. Sergeant Hayes would arrive from Chicago. Even Private Mitchell had promised to drive in from his farm in Iowa. The 11 German women who had chosen to stay in America would gather once more, along with the Americans who had helped transform their lives. Greta moved through her kitchen with the confidence of experience. Her asylum application had been approved in December 1945, and she had become a naturalized citizen 3 years later. The process had required demonstrating good moral character, learning American civics and history, and swearing an oath to her adopted country. When the judge handed her the citizenship certificate, she had wept with a mixture of grief for what she had lost and gratitude for what she had been given. Anna worked beside her, preparing sauerbraten alongside southern fried chicken, potato pancakes next to cornbread. The menu for tonight's dinner reflected their journey, each dish a marker of transformation. They had learned that food could be both memory and promise, a way to honor the past while embracing the future. The restaurant had become popular with locals who appreciated the unusual fusion of flavors, but more importantly, it had become a gathering place for refugees and immigrants finding their way in America. The guests began arriving at 6 o'clock. Captain Morrison entered first, now simply Margaret to those who had once been her charges. She carried a gift, the original cookbook they had created together at Camp Greenlawn, professionally bound and preserved. Private Chen brought photographs from his wedding, showing his new wife and the restaurant expansion they were planning. Sergeant Hayes had stories about his work with refugee resettlement programs in Chicago, helping others find the kind of second chances these women had received. As they sat down to dinner, Greta looked around the table at these faces that had become family. She thought of her mother and sister, confirmed dead in the bombing of Hamburg in 1944, months before she even arrived in America. The grief had nearly destroyed her when she finally received confirmation in 1946, but these people around her had helped her survive it, had shown her that building a new life was not betrayal but tribute. Private Mitchell, now simply Jim to everyone, raised his glass. "To the meal that changed everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To bacon and friendship. To second chances and hard truths. To the family we chose instead of the enemies we were told to be." They raised their glasses in response, and Greta felt the weight of 5 years of transformation in that simple gesture. November 3, 1970. 26 years after Greta Hoffmann first tasted American bacon as a prisoner of war, she stood before a crowd at the Pennsylvania State Historical Society. She had been invited to speak about the untold stories of World War II, specifically about the 11 German women who had chosen to remain in America rather than return to their defeated homeland. Her hair had gone silver, and her English now carried only the faintest trace of a German accent. Beside her on the podium sat Anna, still her partner in both business and life. The Harmony table had grown from a single storefront into a small chain of 3 restaurants across Pennsylvania, but more significantly, it had inspired a model that others followed. Dozens of restaurants across America now practiced what Greta and Anna had pioneered, blending culinary traditions from different cultures, creating spaces where former enemies could become collaborators. Their cookbook, expanded and published commercially in 1962, had sold over 100,000 copies and been translated into 6 languages. Greta spoke to the audience about that first morning when the smell of bacon had seemed like a weapon of psychological warfare, a deliberate demonstration of American abundance designed to break their spirits. "I did not understand then," she said, "that it was not a weapon but an invitation to see our captors as human beings, to question everything we had been taught, to imagine a different kind of future than the one our nation had prepared for us." She described the moment when Private Chen had shown them photographs of concentration camps, when the full weight of their nation's crimes had crashed down upon them. "There is a kind of hunger that food cannot satisfy," she said quietly. "The hunger for innocence once it has been lost. Many of us wanted to starve ourselves in those days, believing we did not deserve the bacon, the bread, the kindness. But our American friends taught us that self-destruction is not penance. Building something better is penance." Anna spoke next, her voice still carrying traces of the shyness she had brought to Camp Greenlawn decades earlier. She talked about the women who had chosen to return to Germany, how they had maintained correspondence over the years. Several had become leaders in rebuilding their country, carrying with them the lessons learned in American captivity. "We were all changed by those months," Anna said. "Whether we stayed or returned, we could never unknow what we had learned about the power of choosing kindness over cruelty, abundance over scarcity, connection over division." After the speeches, the Historical Society hosted a reception featuring dishes from the Harmony table menu. Greta watched as strangers of different backgrounds shared plates of food that blended German and American traditions. A young woman approached her, explaining that her grandmother had been in a different POW camp, one where prisoners were treated harshly and fed meager rations. "She came home full of hatred," the woman said. "How did you come home full of hope?" Greta thought carefully before answering. "I did not come home," she finally said. "I found home. There is a difference. Home is not where you suffer. Home is where you are fed, in body and in spirit, and where you learn to feed others in return. That is the legacy I hope we have built, not just restaurants, but a reminder that even in the darkest times, people can choose to nourish rather than destroy, to welcome rather than reject, to transform enemies into family one meal at a time."